All right, we are going to be talking today about those federal funding cuts that are going to be happening for the NYCHA budget, but we thought we'd bring you up to speed on the nation's largest housing authority. So first slide that I'm going to share with you. NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, has a $3.2 billion operating budget. And $2 billion of that money comes from the federal government directly. They employ some 13,000 folks across the 5 boroughs, and they're facing a budget cut of almost $76 million at this point. You can do some quick math right there and figure that that's about 4% of the overall budget that comes from the feds. So I'm going to move on to the next slide here and show you about NYCHA residents. Now, they comprise nearly 4.9% of the total housing population in the city. That means of everyone living in the city, folks who are living in NYCHA developments or on Section 8 make up about 4.9% of the population. Now, public housing overall represents over 8% of the total rental apartments in the city. So for all of the housing stock in New York City that can be rented, 8% of those belong to NYCHA. They're under their control. And the residents of NYCHA in the buildings that exist, as well as Section 8 vouchers in private ownership housing that's subsidized by the government in the form of Section 8 vouchers, if you combine those two together, they make almost 13% of the total amount of the rental stock in New York City. That's a lot of apartments. So these are the numbers that comprise the amounts of folks who are living in NYCHA, but who are they? If we take a look here, there are some 177,000 roughly families who live in NYCHA developments. There are 403,000 people who are individually sanctioned to live in NYCHA officially. 40% of them are Black, 44% are Hispanic. Those are the largest numbers. It's nearly all Black and Hispanic, but 4% of the population is white, while 5% Asian and 1% make up other. So that's a look at just who some of the population who are living in NYCHA developments and Section 8 housing are. We'll get into that more and figure out how this budget could be affecting them when we talk a little bit later.
Monday in the City Council, Shola Olatoye, the chair of the New York City Housing Authority, testified that the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development put her office on notice that $40.5 million in Section 8 funding will be cut. In addition to the more than $35 million that HUD announced will be pulled from the city last week. The nation's largest public housing authority is staring down the barrel of a nearly $76 million shortfall. Now, that loss of funding will mean NYCHA residents may face everything from reduced maintenance and repair to rent increases.
Is it an act of political retribution from our Queens-born president, or an insight into the vision of the newly confirmed HUD Secretary, Dr. Ben Carson? Well, just a little while ago, to help us make some sense of the current state of the New York City Housing Authority, as well as forecast how NYCHA may have to do more with less, we spoke via Skype with the chair of the City Council's Committee on Public Housing, Councilmember Ritchie Torres. So right off the top, we have a quote from you that was in the Daily News. The presidency of Donald Trump poses the gravest threat to public housing in the 82-year history of the New York City Housing Authority. Now, was that hyperbole or genuine concern?
Genuine concern, because we have a Republican president with a Republican Congress intent on dismantling the social safety net, and public housing is at the heart of it. It's the largest safety net of deeply affordable housing in the country. And so it's no coincidence that the public housing program is the very first program that Donald Trump has chosen to target for severe budget cuts. And keep in mind, before Donald Trump, NYCHA had been so savagely starved of operating and capital dollars that it had come to accumulate $17 billion in capital needs. It reduced its workforce by 2,000 employees. It has been struggling to survive even before Donald Trump. And so Donald Trump can literally throw it off a cliff. That's the concern I have.
Well,
and New York is an exception. Most municipalities have gone in the direction of demolishing their public housing stock. The most egregious example is Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. The public housing in St. Louis was such a catastrophic failure that it was demolished within 20 years of its existence. And so I worry about demolition by neglect here in New York City.
Okay. Councilman, President Trump obviously knows more about real estate development than any other president in history. What message is his funding cuts sending to his home city of New York?
I think the critical message here is that we all have a stake in public housing, regardless of whether or not you live there. The largest employer of public housing residents is the Department of Education, the New York City Police Department, the MTA. It's the public employees who make our city work and move every day. And those employees need a home. And if we deny those employees a stable home, it's not only going to affect the residents who live in public housing, it's going to have consequences for the quality of life and the affordability of New York City at large. So that's the message. If you care about New York City, you should have a stake in the New York City Housing Authority.
So looking at the budget, that's some $3 billion. These funding cuts represent about 4% of that. So there's a lot of people who are up in arms about that 4%, but there's another maybe silent majority who's saying, hey, it's only 4%. Do you think this is where it stops or just a sign of things to come?
Well, again, NYCHA is in such a financially fragile position that it cannot afford to absorb a new level of budget cuts. It's standing on the precipice as we speak. And there are two kinds of budget cuts. So there's Congress slashing the budget, which is yet to happen, although we know that the Trump administration is proposing a $6 million cut in HUD's overall budget, which would represent a catastrophe for public housing. That would be a crisis. But even without congressional action, HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, has the ability to slash funding for public housing in two senses. So it's a complicated, but I'll take the time to explain it. Public housing funding is based on a formula. And HUD has been manipulating the inputs that go into the formula by overestimating the expenses of the housing authority, by underestimating the expenses of the housing authority, and overestimating the revenues of the housing authority so that it generates a lower dollar amount. And then public housing authorities like NYCHA do not receive 100% of that dollar amount, only what is known as a proration, a percentage. And HUD has lowered that percentage from 87% to 85%, resulting in a $27 million funding loss. So that's for the Public Housing Operating Fund. Then there's the Section 8 program. There's the Section 8 HAP, which is the rental assistance. Right. That has been reduced from 99% to 95%, which is a $45.7 million budget cut. And then Section 8 administration from 84 to 77%, that's a $7.6 million budget cut. So that's $81 million worth of funding losses without a new budget, without congressional action. You add in the $6 billion reduction in HUD's overall budget, and what you have is a catastrophe.
Well, Councilman, you said what you have is a catastrophe. That's the current situation. Moving forward, how would you sort of characterize the first weeks of Ben Carson and how he's sort of responded to his new position?
I think there's a cruel irony here. Ben Carson is a doctor. He testified at his confirmation hearing that he's committed to promoting public health within affordable housing. Or if you're disinvesting from public housing, if you're siphoning resources away from the core infrastructure of public housing, then you're contributing to more mold and more leaks, lead, and more public health hazards in public housing. So the Hippocratic Oath tells us to do no harm. He's doing real harm to public housing.
So you are the chair of public housing in the city council. I wondered what are the real impacts going to be on NYCHA residents now that this budget cut is coming, and what the city council can do to sort of stand in the gap?
Well, I mean, as you know, public housing residents live in some of the worst conditions in the city. And so those conditions will only worsen, right? Tenants will have to wait even longer for basic repairs and improvements in their apartments, wait weeks, months, even years. You'll have fewer caretakers maintaining properties on the ground. You'll have boilers and elevators break down with greater frequency, more frequent gas outages. Those are some of the problems that will arise from disinvestment, from a lack of funding. And, the city we should do more to fill in the gaps that NYCHA will face. But keep in mind that we're going to be facing a comprehensive assault on the social safety net. Right? We risk losing money not only for public housing, but for affordable housing in general, for social services, for healthcare. City funds are a scarce resource. There may not be enough funds to go around to fill those gaps because we're facing attacks from every front from the Trump administration. I mean, this might sound like hyperbole, but I truly believe that these budget cuts against the New York City Housing Authority are the first salvo in Donald Trump's war on New York City and his war on the social safety net and his war on the urban poor. And we have no choice but to resist because we cannot afford to absorb the shock of these budget cuts.
I think we're going to leave it right there. Well, thank you for joining us, council member. Next time you have to get back to the table, okay?
I would love to. Even though I'm from the Bronx,
I was expecting somebody to come walking behind him, and go viral.
Child was in. Well, we appreciate it, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, sir. Now joining us live in the studio is Elizabeth Brown, the Supervising Analyst for Housing, Environment, and Infrastructure at the New York City Independent Budget Office, which provides nonpartisan information about the city budget and tax revenues. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, I think we should just, appropriate place would be to start off with the words of the councilman, in which he described these proposed cuts as the gravest threat to public housing in the 82-year history of New York City Housing Authority. How would you characterize those statements? Is this an accurate assessment?
Well, as the council member mentioned, the Housing Authority has been grossly underfunded for many years. They have not been receiving the amount of money they need, as calculated even by HUD, to run their developments. So for many years, they've been doing more, or just sort of getting by with less than they need. So this is not necessarily a new situation, and the funding cuts that we're discussing so far, the $75 billion that we discussed, this is something that they've seen previously. What's new is, and we don't know exactly what's going to be in Trump's budget, we haven't seen it yet, but we've seen these leaked documents about a $6 billion cut to HUD, and that would trickle down to very massive cuts to the Housing Authority, and that would be something that's greater than what we've seen before.
So in a very real way, this could have ramifications for people who are currently residing in NYCHA. We've heard everything from rent increases to sort of these
repairs.
Stop work order, like nothing's going to happen after 4:30 because it costs too much to send and repair people out. But where are we with the current state of NYCHA? I know you recently authored a report for the Independent Budget Office on the state of disrepair now.
Yes, so we took a look at HUD inspects housing authorities across the country, and we looked at the most recent inspection scores for NYCHA developments, and results were a little grim. 16%, we found that 16% of people living in NYCHA are living in apartments that conditions are so poor that you'd consider them to be troubled. The federal government considers to be troubled, and that translates
right now.
Right now, and that's 64,000 people.
Yeah.
A much smaller share, 5% or 20,000 people live in housing that's considered high performing, so they're doing okay.
Gotcha.
That's 5%. 5%, but those are smaller.
That's tiny.
Yeah, those are usually smaller, newer buildings.
Right.
The lion's share of NYCHA residents, the rest between the 64 and the 20,000, are living in what they call standard performers. But we found almost more than a third of those households are closer to the troubled end. So
to the 5% that's
then
doing well.
that's a much smaller.
We actually have a graphic that we can share with the developments by borough. So Brooklyn has 98 developments that comprise about 60,000 apartments. So how's Brooklyn doing compared to the rest of the stock? Did they break down that way?
It was actually pretty evenly distributed. The worst housing development was in the Bronx. Okay. But when you looked by borough, there were actually two of the most highly rated were in Brooklyn. Yeah. So it wasn't by borough that we could say that the worst developments are in one particular borough. It was more looking at the age of the development, how many apartments. That was the better indicator that the conditions would be poor. But
one thing we can glean from this as well, while Brooklyn doesn't have the most developments, we have the highest population of folks who are in NYCHA developments.
So these cuts, if they're impacting maintenance, they'll have you'll feel it here.
Elizabeth, now I read that NYCHA was on track to actually have a surplus, but now they're facing a $14 million deficit.
Yes.
Your report was released last month in February. How would it be different if you knew that this funding cut was looming?
It wouldn't be different because this was based on historical data inspections that were done prior to any of this. But what it means for the future is, let's say, these funding cuts go through, maintenance, they can't have maintenance workers come later in the day to pay overtime, so there's deferred maintenance. It could mean in 2 years, the share of New Yorkers living in troubled housing might be larger.
So you guys synthesize all these numbers in a nonpartisan way. You look at the revenues and the taxes. But do you ever issue recommendations? Would the IBO have something to say, all right, NYCHA, things are going to get tight. You might want to consider.
We do not issue recommendations, but NYCHA already has a plan issued several years ago, called Next Generation NYCHA, that was meant to streamline some efficiencies, also raise some new revenue. So I imagine they'll be looking more closely at that.
What about this this idea of like selling some of the out spaces and buildings? We've seen parking lots turn into developments or put new buildings up.
Yeah, that's part of the Next Generation NYCHA plan. And at the hearing we had earlier this week, I think the council member referenced, there was discussion of this. It's called privatization. It's often referred to as privatization. Right. The Housing Authority seems committed to that, perhaps even more now, as a way to raise revenues if they're losing revenue on the federal side. IBO doesn't have a particular stance on that, but this is something that the Housing Authority is considering very seriously.
Is there anything in particular that people sort of can do to call their local, who do people call at this point to voice their concerns?
As with any concerns you have about what's going on in the federal government, you're members of Congress or city council members. I know they're organizing. Any local elected officials, call. That's what most people do.
I'm stealing one question because we're completely out of time, but overall, looking at that $3.3 billion that's NYCHA operating, this cut represents about 4% of that. Is the sky really falling down, or are we making a big deal out of this?
Well, the reason this is a big deal is, as the councilmember mentioned, this cut actually doesn't have anything to do with the president's budget or the congressional appropriations. It has to do with a formula change. That's before all of that. We haven't even gotten to the president's budget, where it's likely, given some documents we've seen, that cuts will be even greater. So 4% could be a lot bigger percent, though. And we'll see tomorrow, I think.
Independent Budget Office.
I think the council member called it the opening salvo, but we'll definitely be watching.
Absolutely. And
so we'll wait.
If we're not watching, we know Elizabeth is.
All right.
Absolutely.